So I've now finished all of these short stories by Akatagawa in this Penguin Classics collection, and in this video I'll talk about the most recent one that I finished, the final one, which is the section based on the autobiographical works by Akatagawa, including a couple published posthumously. So he committed suicide at age 35, and the later works are almost a suicide note, are very much talk about the theme of his death and his sort of depression and mental anguish that he experienced. So all of these 6 stories are quite dark and involve themes of death and loss. They're not no sort of comedy elements to them like there were in some of the other stories. The first story is called Daijoji Shinsuke, the early years, which is sort of a collection of stories about his childhood. It's split up into different sections where he talks about the place he grew up in, the school he went to, his family, his relationship with his parents, and poverty, how he grew up in poverty, and because of that, how he sort of hated his parents. I mean, he says he loved them, but at the same time, he still hated them because of the poverty. Like, they weren't lower class, they were sort of lower middle class. So he said that they'd had to do a lot of lying and deceiving socially in order to sort of maintain appearances when they were really struggling. I mean, they weren't in risk of being homeless or starving, but they were still at that sort of bottom rung of middle class, if you can call it that. And so he talks about how sort of the issues he had with that and the things he wanted, which is mostly books. He always wanted books, and how he had to sort of squeeze money out of his parents and even lie to them to get money to get these books. So it's pretty short, but it ends with sort of a to be continued, but he never did write any more to it. So it's just sort of a glimpse into his childhood. The second story is called The Writer's Craft, and this involves a character who's sort of a stand-in for Akatagawa, who is working at a sort of a naval training facility in a civilian position, and he sort of has, because he's a writer, he sort of has this job of writing funeral orations for which he's done a couple times, and just sort of anything that this sort of school that he works at needs written, they go to him for it. So someone has passed away, and they go to him and say, "Hey, can you write the speech for the funeral?" Sort of a eulogy. And he's swamped with work. He's got all these other deadlines he needs to meet, and he didn't even really know the guy, but he's like, "Sure, I'll come up with some generic platitudes and whatever." So he does it. He sort of rushes through it and gets it out of the way, and he's like, "It's not great, but whatever, it's done." And then he can get back to sort of his main work, and he goes to the funeral, and the speech is given, and the family just sort of break down crying. It really moves them, it moves everyone there, and he's sort of, it really strikes him because he didn't put hardly any effort into this, but it seems the reception seems really great. And then to sort of compare that to later on, he's talking to someone who read a critic criticizing this story that he worked on and poured sort of his heart into, and the critic sort of tears it apart, and it just doesn't go over with the public. And so the story ends with him really sort of struck by the fact that this piece that he spent half an hour on, that he didn't really care about, moved more people than this other piece of writing that he poured his whole heart into. And he sort of has this moment where he's really thinking about what am I doing as a writer, and so that, anyways, that's the Writer's Craft. The third story, a really short one, it's just called The Baby's Sickness, and it talks about this couple who their baby gets sick, and the baby then gets worse, and it seems that the baby's going to die. It's sort of hinting at that, but eventually the baby gets better. But it's just the story of the sort of husband and the wife trying to deal with like having a child sick and potentially on their deathbed. And all the fear and anguish and anxiety that naturally would come with that. And he says at the end of it that once the baby recovered, he was thinking of writing a story about it, but he was worried that it might jinx it. So he wanted to wait a bit. And so he did. So the child grew up, and he wrote this story about his experience. So again, all of these stories sort of involve either death or have sort of a very dark tone to them. But they all do feel a lot more real, a lot more not necessarily relatable, but understandable in a way. Like all of other Akatagawa's stories that were clearly fiction were okay. Some of them I really enjoyed, but it's this final section where it borders on nonfiction. It borders on, journalistic, sorry, not journalistic, but like diary entries. It's so autobiographical, but not just sort of a recounting of one's life, but a true expression of one's feelings at various points in their life. So the fourth short story is called Death Register, and this one is recounting the sort of lives and well, actually more the deaths of people in his life. So like his mother, who was an insane woman, he had a sister that passed away young, and how sort of she was the most loved of all of them, and not really his jealousy of his family's affection for this dead sister, but just his feelings surrounding her. In fact, he says he feels closer to this sister than any of his other sisters or siblings. In fact, he says he feels very close to this sister that he really never really knew. And so this death register is just sort of his reflecting on death and reflecting on the death of those around him. And at this point, he must clearly be thinking about his own death and his own life. I mean, this one was published less than a year before he killed himself. So you can tell it was very much on his mind. The fifth story is one of his more popular ones. It's called The Life of a Stupid Man, and it's a very interesting one. It's very autobiographical, but it is written in very short, paragraph or two, a section that's just a paragraph or two, and it's just a brief sort of glimpse through a window of various moments in his life. It's almost as if your life's flashing before your eyes, and you just get a sort of a sensation and imagery. It's almost poetic in that way, and then it moves on to a totally different story, and sort of jumps through like 40 different stories. He talks about different things like the women, the lovers he's had, his, of course, thoughts of death, his sort of insomnia, and the amount of drugs he has to take to sleep properly. A few major events in his lifetime, but again, they're just really brief snippets. It's literally, I would say, his life flashing before his eyes, and it just ends with him saying how exhausted he is from writing, and he just can't write anymore. And this one was published after he committed suicide. Final story, titled Spinning Gears, also was published posthumously. This one sort of deals with mental illness in a way. It talks about how these spinning gears, he sees these translucent spinning gears sort of in the sides of his vision, and whenever he sees these cogs and gears turning, he knows that he's soon about to get a headache or a migraine. This has happened various times, and he has to take drugs to go to sleep and escape that feeling. But it's just sort of a short story of, I mean, it's straight up autobiographical. He uses his own name as the main character of it. So he's at a hotel, spending the week at a hotel, finishing up this story, and by the end of it, he's like, I'm not going to make enough money from this story to pay for the hotel for the week, but at least he did it. And throughout this story, he keeps running into so many different coincidences that he sort of has this feeling that, I don't know if it's fate or destiny, or he's being sort of chased by something, but he'll see something with wings, and he thinks of Icarus, and he sees an airplane, and the only cigarettes available at the hotel are the brand Airplane, and that's just one example. There's a few other just coincidences. He keeps seeing things or coming across things, or people will say things that he connects to previous things, and it just seems like there's all these weird coincidences leading up to something, seemingly. And the very end of it, I'll just read it. His wife comes to him and says, it wasn't any one thing, I just had this feeling that you were going to die. And then it cuts off, and it says, this was the most terrifying experience of my life. In the final paragraph, I don't have the strength to keep writing this. To go on living with this feeling is painful beyond description. Isn't there someone kind enough to strangle me in my sleep? So, again, that one was published posthumously. He was obviously going through a lot of turmoil and a lot of mental illness and a lot of depression, but he was a brilliant writer. He did personally know Soseki. Soseki sort of wrote letters encouraging him when he was in university and had started writing He talks about the day Sosuke died. He talks about visiting Sosuke's grave. So there is sort of that continuity there between Sosuke as a writer in the Meiji era and Akatagawa as sort of the Taisho era writer, who again, I'm noticing just from what I've read, noticing connections and threads between Sosuke and then in the Showa era, Dazai, who also committed suicide and also obviously had maybe a different sort of mental anguish and upset with the world. But I am glad that I got to read those three authors. Different in their own way, but I can sort of make connections between the three of them. But anyway, so that was a collection of short stories by Akatagawa Ryunosuke.